They asked how a seamstress could forge 500 passports. I told them the truth. You don't start with paper. You start with a habit. Every morning before the siren, I boiled a kettle until the steam wrote weather on the window. If it fogged fast, I worked on photographs. If it clung slow, I worked on stamps. The town learned to listen to my kettle the way men listen to orders. I learned to listen to silence, because silence tells you who is left to save. The first passport wasn't a masterpiece. It was a patch, like mending a sleeve in a place no one looks. A boy, axle grease under his nails, needed to become a student from the coast. His birth year moved 2 steps to the left. His eyes, once coal, became river. I did not change his face. I changed the way paper saw him. Paper believes whatever ink says with confidence. The police love their stamps. So did I. Theirs were official because they said so loudly. Mine were official because no one doubted a woman who smelled like laundry and spoke softly to glue. I learned the grain of cardstock by touch, the way bakers learn when dough forgives you. Some cards bent like bread crust, some bent like rules. I kept the ones that bent like rules. Photographs were the knife edge. I baked faces in oven light, turning the tray as if they were biscuits, not brown, not pale, simply inevitable. A girl with a birthmark near her lip lost it to shadow and gained a hat. A father who could not afford to be Jewish in public became a man whose mouth told customs officers he was tired, not afraid. Fatigue is believable. Fear is a sermon. I found that names behave if you give them neighbors. Paper likes to see a father near a mother, a street near a square, a town near another town. I built families out of maps and parish ledgers, stole saints' days for birthdays, and gave every child a teacher who might remember them vaguely if asked. Vague memory is the best witness a forged life can buy. The first week, I made 7. The second week, 12. By the end of the month, the table had learned to carry 20 at a time without trembling. I sorted them by risk, the way women sort laundry. Officers' wives on top, they get attention, then merchants, then students, then children whose shoes squeak. Shoes betray more people than ink. I didn't pray for miracles. I prayed for alignment. A pen that didn't cough, a stamp pad that didn't bleed, a clerk having a good meal. Miracles are loud. Alignment passes for competence. Competence walks past uniforms and nods to the man who ought to stop it, and he doesn't, because everything looks as it should. That's the only magic there ever was. Paper came from places that did not look like danger. A haberdasher's ledger with a few blank leaves. The tail end of municipal forms a clerk throughout because the margin line sat a whisper too far left. Index cards from the school that changed its curriculum faster than it changed its stationery. I kept nothing that bragged about itself. Loud paper gets arrested, quiet paper gets stamped. Stamps were a religion whose saints changed with the week. The prefect preferred clean edges. The adjutant liked a stamp that looked a little tired. The station master worshipped alignment. I learned their beliefs the way a seamstress learns a customer's shoulders, not to flatter them, but to stop the fabric from arguing. When the town seal arrived bright from some office, I let it sleep under a book until the shine learned to be useful. When a pad started to bleed, I found a way to make the smudge look like a journey. Paper forgives a life that appears to have traveled. Photographs had to learn modesty. Children glare at cameras like defendants. I showed them how to look bored. Boredom crosses borders better than charm. Women tucked stray hair behind ears that would someday be cataloged by nobody. Men lowered their chins to trade defiance for fatigue. Fatigue passes through offices uncontested because it flatters the clerks who live there. We never counterfeited courage. We counterfeited paperwork that allowed courage to walk out the door wearing its own face. Names arrived like guests, introduced to their neighborhoods so they would not feel strange when spoken aloud. I borrowed streets no officer had ever visited and uncles no officer would dare insult. I matched handwriting the way a dressmaker matches a hem. Not perfectly, just enough that a moving person looks right. Perfection is suspicious. The world is built out of almost. The workroom learned the hours of the occupation the way bakeries learn the dawn. Curfew gave me quiet. Sirens gave me urgency. Market days gave me excuses. On Tuesdays, the kettle's steam meant photographs. On Fridays, seals. On Saturdays, I stitched family, trees no parish would contradict. I listened to the tram more closely than to sermons. Its honest lie of 3 minutes late told me which officer would arrive early to compensate, and which would arrive late to deny it. I placed passports in the pockets of those habits. Not all requests were possible. A woman asked to be 19 again. I told her the town would not believe in the miracle unless she learned to walk like it. A man begged for a profession that would have given him enemies. I found him a different hat. Children wanted dogs printed somewhere. I hid small kindnesses that only their mothers would find. An accent, a dash, a saint's day pushed to a Sunday, so birthdays could be celebrated loudly. By winter the table had a rhythm that felt like a heart. 4, breath. 4 from the lamp above. Click, pause. Click from the typewriter that no longer had a ribbon anybody could boast about. Shuffle, press. Lift from the stamp whose tiredness had become authority. People arrived frightened and left merely worried. Worried is the correct temperature for survival. I never believed I was making perfect documents. I was making believable people. Paper does not save anyone, timing does. So I learned the town's calendar by its mundane saints. Milk that shines dictates waiting. Windows that fog mandate going. Bread that cools permits leaving clean. The passports followed those hours out of the door, and the door remembered to be polite. Twice, not thrice, for as long as it took a life to become elsewhere. The first time an officer held one of my passports long enough to make me afraid, I learned a rule no handbook writes. Don't defend the paper, defend the person the paper belongs to. I complimented his penmanship on the ledger instead. He straightened, pleased to be seen as a man with a craft. While he admired himself, the passport admired gravity and behaved like it belonged there. Paper that waits looks innocent. I built cover stories the way seamstresses build linings, quiet, breathable, and stronger than the dress. The student from the coast carried sand in a matchbox and a postcard of a lighthouse with a smudge where a date should be. The widow had a grocery list in 2 hands, hers and a late husband's untidy scrawl, borrowed from a parish book never returned. The porter kept a folded receipt for boots he had not bought, but could argue about convincingly. Arguments are more believable than silence at checkpoints. Stamps taught me humility. On the days my pad bled, I stopped forging and started aging. I scuffed edges, taught new ink to look tired, pressed a document through the lining of an old jacket so it would learn the wallet's curve. I drank weak tea and used the rest to yellow paper just enough that men would feel nostalgic without knowing it. Nostalgia is a form of trust no one admits to. Photographs wanted to be remembered. I trained them to be recallable instead. Faces that are recallable carry one ordinary feature clerks can repeat. Glasses that don't flatter, a hat that crowds the brow. The bored mouth of someone who has waited in lines all her life. I clipped highlights from eyes with a soft graphite touch and let shadows settle where cheekbones tried to be heroic. Heroism is suspicious at counters. Errands pass. By the time I reached 50, the table moved like a factory that knew it was a church. We observed the sacraments of order. Pile, align, stamp, breathe. Neighbors brought postage and left with names. The baker's boy became a cousin to a man with a bicycle 2 towns east. The schoolmistress acquired a sister whose children were always sick on Tuesdays, an alibi that sounds like life. A priest I did not trust became an uncle. Mistrust kept his papers excellent. The number 500 did not begin as a goal. It arrived slowly, like snow that insists and then pretends it was always there. We kept ledgers not of people, but of patterns. Who traveled when the tram lied on schedule? Which checkpoints softened after lunch? Which sergeant respected alignment more than authority? I seasoned each passport with a pinch of town. A grocer's stringtail, flour dust at the fold, the faint vanilla a stamp pad learns after a clerk's cake day. Smells enter rooms faster than arguments. Once, a raid swallowed my workroom whole. I survived because my neighbors had rehearsed ordinary on purpose. The butcher argued about liver for 9 minutes. The librarian misshelved a shelf so beautifully the officers sat down to fix it. A child did not cry when told to stand still. When they left, my stamps were elsewhere and my photographs smelled like bread. It is difficult to arrest a bakery. By spring, the town had learned to fold itself small and mail itself across borders. People asked me if forging was lying. I told them I was correcting spelling in a sentence the war had written poorly. A man is not a problem to be solved by a stamp. He is a person to be delivered by one. We delivered 500. The number mattered less than this. Paper learned to tell a truer truth. When I slept, I dreamed in fonts, serifs that forgave me, numerals that landed with the weight of birthdays, umlauts that agreed to be modest. In the morning, the kettle wrote weather on the window, and I sorted the day. Fast fod for photos, slow for seals, a breeze for signatures. Outside, the tram confessed its three, faithful to its dishonesty. Inside, ink said citizen, and citizens walked out of my door wearing faces that matched their tomorrows. Night did not fall. It assembled, lamp by lamp, window by window, until the town remembered how to be invisible. That was when the factory opened. My table, the kettle, the typewriter with a ribbon that prayed for ink and survived on faith, the stamp pad sleeping under folded cloth to learn humility. Factories make products. Mine made persons. The raw materials were unimpressive. Offcuts of card, ledger pages with polite margins, photographs that smelled faintly of developer and bread. The power source was the tram's honest lie, 3 minutes late, twice each hour, which shifted patrols just enough for neighbors to become elsewhere. I began by sorting the night like laundry. Urgent to the left, children, couriers, men with notices pinned to their doors. Complicated to the right, accents I couldn't fake in a morning, birthdays that asked saints for help, routine in the center, wives traveling to aunties, widowers joining brothers near rivers. Routine is where art hides. A town survives because most of its miracles look like errands. Paper first, quiet stock only. Official cards declare themselves with a shine you can hear. I needed the kind that apologizes for existing and does what it's told. I ran fingertips along edges until I could feel a sheet's obedience. A good sheet accepts a stamp the way a well-brought-up child accepts soup, without drama. If the fiber argued, I fed it to the stove and thanked it for guarding someone else's life by failing here. Then the seals, saints of my small religion. I kept 3 families of roundness, strict, sleepy, and tired. Strict for stations that liked to see their beliefs reflected back to them. Sleepy for offices where clerks married their pencils and went home early. Tired for desks that had seemed too much paper to think any of it mattered. A strict seal lands square and invites respect. A sleepy seal lands slightly shy of the edge and purchases pity. A tired seal lands true but soft, and that softness feels like truth to men who want to go home. Ink was a temper to manage. Blue is aspirational. It believes in itself. Black is final. It believes in you. On nights when rumor said audits prowled, I let blue sleep and carry black like a psalm. If the pad began to bleed, I did not fight it. I redirected it, pressing the seal through a handkerchief so the excess read his journey. Documents that look a little traveled are forgiven by men who have stood too long on their feet. Photographs next. The trick was to lower the light until every face confessed fatigue instead of fear. I taught hats to be ordinary and collars to be clean without boasting. A child who loved his best shirt learned the international language of itch. Hands moving to scratch at the exact moment the shutter blinked, making him a person whose mother will scold him later, not a hero anyone would want to remember. I snipped a stray gleam from an eye with the gentlest graphite. Mere people pass. Saints stick in the throat of a boarder. Type, my quiet orchestra. I tune numerals first. A 9 that knows how to sit. A 3 that doesn't shout. A 1 with a serif so modest it might be mistaken for dust. Dates wore the coat of yesterday. Addresses wore the comfortable shoes of nearby. I borrowed clerks' habits by the yard. A comma that leans. A capital that forgives. An ampersand taught by a man who married young and never learned to write alone. A forged life is not a sculpture. It's a sentence with the right accent. Then cover, the lining no uniform will ever see. A student receives a library slip overdue by 1 day, because 1 is the most defendable sin. A widow gets a grocery list with 2 hands on it. A porter carries a receipt for boot polish and the self-respect to argue about it. A priest takes a baptism card slightly smudged, the kind of smudge that says hurry rather than fraud. I stitched each life to a pocket object a man might touch, without looking when questioned. Touch is older than memory. Officers notice it and call it confidence. Between each set, I listened to the building. 2 doors left. A hinge confessed in the same key each hour. Down the hall, a loose board sang and then shut up when the night changed shifts. Outside, the dogs yawned when fed late and performed their boredom like professionals. When the tram rang its small lie, I moved certain files up and others down. Schedules run the city. Intervals save it. Neighbors came on foot, never in pairs, never on the hour. A woman brought buttons to be matched and left with a name that would not get her counted at the wrong desk. A boy delivered twine and departed with an uncle who lived 2 towns over, a bicycle, and a story about a bell tower that never worked quite right. I gave each person a fault to carry, a habit of being early, a tendency to overpay for eggs, a dislike of dogs. Faults are passports. Perfect people are contraband. When fear walked in, I did not comfort it. I sorted it. Fear that talks gets tea. Fear that shakes gets work. Fear that freezes gets a list to read aloud. Streets, saints, shops, until it warms into usefulness. By the time I pressed a seal into a corner that would meet a man with a hat and a rubber stamp, the person in front of me believed the life in their hands the way you believe your own signature. Not because it is true, but because it is yours. Toward midnight, the room became a choir of small certainties. Stamp lifted clean, photograph that refuses to pose, date that sits like it paid rent, signature that neither apologizes nor brags. I stacked the finished work into families, not by blood, but by routes and habits, so that if a patrol made a street late, one life could cover another without anyone noticing the kindness. Kindness, filed correctly, looks like coincidence. When I blew out the lamp for the hour that lets rumor move safely, the factory rested but did not close. The kettle's ghost still drew weather on the window. The stamp pad dreamed of alignment. The typewriter listened to the tram and learned its 3-minute catechism by heart. 500 was not a sum. It was a rhythm. Paper in, persons out. The town exhaling through a seam no one else could see. Quality control is the part of forgery no one brags about because it sounds like laundry. But laundry keeps towns alive. I kept 3 trials for each identity: the thumb test, the pocket test, and the stranger test. The thumb test happened under the lamp. Press along the seal's belly and watch whether ink creeps into the paper's grain like rain into thirsty soil. If it sat on the fibers, the paper was pretending to be what it wasn't. Into the stove with it, and thank it for failing here instead of at a window with a hat and a rubber stamp. The pocket test happened in the dark. I slid the document into an old wallet and walked the room twice while the loose board sang. Then I took it out and listened. Paper that has been truly carried size when you unfold it. Paper that only wants to pass an exam cracks. Size travel, cracks confess. The stranger test was the most important and the cheapest. I handed the papers to a neighbor who didn't know the person and told them 2 lies and 1 truth about the life they were holding. If they interrupted me on the truth, no. The ant lives near the canal, not the square. The documents were ready. People who correct small things in loud rooms survive bigger ones. Supplies arrived in innocent disguises. A plumber's daughter learned to wrap card in lengths of pipe felt. A postmaster with artrite ludita preferred envelopes pre-addressed to himself because it simplified pain, and so my paper learned to travel in circles. The sacristan kept wax that smelled of bees and Sundays. I borrowed it to season cords so knots remembered priests more than policemen. None of it would have mattered without the clerk who understood the difference between order and obedience. She never brought me stamps. She brought me habits. Which desk insists on alignment? Which inspector likes fat signatures that overshoot the line? Which office goes quiet after soup? We had decoys for nights when rumor turned to weather. 1 batch of passports lived to be caught. 2 bright, 2 matching, a parade begging for a baton. We let those travel where men needed to feel successful. The real passengers went out smelling of linen and coal, with a torn corner that told a different story at each table where documents are fed to officials who are hungry for significance. Risk asked its own tithe. I paid with time, never with names. If a pad began to bleed, all work pivoted to aging and cover. If an officer started pronouncing umlauts correctly, I moved my people toward rivers and ferries where water asks fewer questions than rail. If the tram's honest lie of 3 minutes became 2, I shifted routes to places where clocks obey bread. Bread cools when it is ready. Men cool when paper tells them they have done enough for the day. We ran test runs the way bakers test ovens, with cheap dough first. I sent a safe neighbor, always someone with plausible errands. Through a checkpoint with a letter I had no fear of losing. If the guard noticed the comma in the address, we knew to season that post with more fatigue and less pride. If the guard asked about the hat, we taught hats to apologize with their brims. There were nights the factory had to learn invisibility quickly. A knock thrice would mean confession, so we trained the whole street to answer twice and only twice. On those nights, the dogs were fed late so that they yawned at uniforms. The kettle was told to pretend it had never whistled in its life. Stamps slept under shirts that smelled of babies and starch. Photographs tucked themselves into cookbooks open to market soup. When boots clattered on the stairs, the room became Monday. Mending, buttons, a child's elbow patched with an apple printed in cheerful thread. I kept an emergency burn kit in a cake tin labeled vanilla, string, matches, the precise amount of salt a baker keeps by the oven to scare off bad luck. We burned very little. Better to convert danger into elsewhere. I learned how to borrow official fire. A request stamped correctly goes to the bottom of a pile that will never be touched, especially if the prefect's nephew believes the request flatters his French. Bureaucracy is the safest stove in any city. It cooks documents slowly until they become yesterday. Sometimes someone came asking for miracles I could not afford. A man wanted a passport that would make him innocent. Paper can make you elsewhere. It cannot make you forgiven. I gave him a careful route and a hat that did not attract stories. A woman wanted to be married to a dead man because the living ones were dangerous. I gave her a widow's card and taught her how to look like fatigue had cleaned her grief and put it on a shelf. By the time we crossed 300, the table worked from muscle memory. I could feel a document's temperature with my wrist. A cool paper passes. A warm one argues. We taught the town to be cool. Arrive after the second bell. Leave before the third. Fold your anger into your pocket and let it warm your hand instead of your voice. We saved hours everywhere, and hours are the only currency a small place can use to purchase a future. One night the typewriter's ribbon gave up pretending and became string. We adapted. I traced letters with graphite, pressed them under thin cloth, and let the imprint whisper ink to the paper's skin. It worked because the clerk on the other end wasn't grading. He was coping. Coping is a language. We spoke it fluently. I wrote a note to myself on the inside of a teacup with a hair. Perfection is suspicious, almost as human. When the light hit the porcelain just so, I remembered to stop improving and start finishing. We kept a ledger that never named anyone, only moments. Window fogged equals go. Milk shines equals wait. Tram 3 equals move. Dogs yawn equals safe. Stamp bleeds equals age. Hungry clerk equals praise alignment. Board sergeant equals give him a receipt to scold. 500 was never the miracle. The miracle was that, by the time we reached the number, the town had learned to manufacture its own ordinary on command. Near dawn, I stacked the night's work into families of escape and taught each stack its patience. Rest before slicing. Documents, like loaves, tear if you cut them hot. I blew out the lamp. The room kept breathing for breath, for without me. Outside, the tram practiced its 3-minute honesty. Inside, the seal slept, the pad stopped bleeding, and the typewriter forgave itself for not being perfect. The factory would open again when the town remembered it needed to be invisible. They say a forger's enemy is detail. Mine was pride. Detail saves you. Pride gets you counted. So I built breakages into everything I made. The way tailors hide room for breath in a seam. A date where the one leans a hair to the left because the clerk who trained me had a son with a limp. A loop on the G that grows tired at the end of a line. A staple removed and put back one hole lower because the desk where it lived wobbles. I loved my mistakes like children. I wanted to grow up ordinary. I learned the ecology of offices. Each desk is a weather system. This one rains alignment. That one blows sympathy when a face looks like Monday. The prefect's nephew polishes his stamp until you can see your guilt in it. The old sergeant at the bridge respects a document that has learned to sigh. A paper that sighs says 3 truths at once. It has a pocket, it has a history, and it is tired of being proof. I taught my papers to sigh. When fear swelled, I adjusted the menu. Hard nights asked for black ink and strict seals. Soft nights let blue come out and kiss the edge like someone leaving early to catch a tram that refuses to be on time. Once a rumor said the station master had fallen in love with serifs. I changed nothing except I praised his penmanship. Men arrest less when they feel seen. People often arrived wanting new lives that fit like costumes. I sent them home with lives that fit like coats, pliable, weathered, full of pockets. A dancer begged for Vienna. I gave her Besançon and a cousin with weak lungs. easier to explain on stairs. A boy wanted a passport to make him older. I gave him a cap that sits too low and taught him how to nod at questions as if he had heard them yesterday. Performances for stages. Boarders prefer habits. The factory had allies it never named. The librarian misfiled obedience into the shelf where courage lives. The baker dusted edges with flour, so papers smelled like a morning nobody wants to interfere with. The postmistress timed our errands to bells she didn't ring. A clerk in the big building taught us the sacred heresy, twice, not thrice. In return, I taught her how to keep ink from bleeding on days when sorrow makes hands too warm. We rehearsed failure as carefully as success. If a checkpoint asked for dogs, we were allergic. If it asked for cigarettes, we were trying to quit. If it asked for God, we were late for a baptism that had been postponed to Sunday so the godmother could travel. Each answer bought seconds, and seconds are stairs. You climb them or you don't. 500 did not arrive like a victory. It arrived like maintenance. The kettle wrote weather on the window. I read it as assignments. Fast fog, photographs. Slow seals. No fog. Today is for aging and cover. I ran my wrist over a stack and sorted by temperature. Cool passes, warm argues. Documents that argue are like men who declare themselves harmless. You listen, but you don't cross with them. Once, an officer with clean boots asked me, quite kindly, whether I felt I was lying to the state. I told him states lie to paper all the time. I was telling the truth to people. He liked the sentence because it made him feel philosophical, and a philosophical man is 2 minutes slower at his job. I spent those minutes the way I spend salt, sparingly, with gratitude. There were bad nights. A child's photo blinked at the wrong moment, and the blink looked like a flinch. I remade it while his mother folded my laundry, and the town pretended the siren was weather. Another time, a seal landed too proud. I sanded the impression with a scrap of linen and taught it to sit among the modest. Pride breaks, modesty passes. The most dangerous request came with tears and a perfectly plausible story. Plausible stories frighten me more than miracles. Miracles announce themselves. Plausible stories can sneak. I asked for errands instead. Shops, routes, which bell makes you late for nothing. When her answers wobbled, I made her a passport anyway. One that would fail safely at a low desk where failure teaches instead of punishes. Not everyone is meant to cross a bridge. Some are meant to stay and keep the lights behaving. Near the end of the second 100, the typewriter developed a hiccup on the 2. I did not fix it. I taught my numbers to expect it. A town that knows its own flaws can walk straight through a room that wants to improve it to death. I left the 2 alone and signed a dozen papers with dates that carried a little limp. Limping dates are true in a way straight ones are not. They remember who walked them there. When the audit finally came, a tidy man with a tidy folder and a tidy hunger, the room became a Monday. Buttons, hems, a kettle that never whistled. He asked for names. I gave him fonts. He asked for routes. I gave him weather. He asked for numbers. I gave him laundry. 50 whites, 12 blues, 3 that bleed if you don't wait between the second bell and the third. He wrote it all down, satisfied to be told a truth he could not use. The count ticked forward, noshed with breath. 4, breath. 4 from the lamp, 3 from the tram, twice from the door that had become polite. We sent a widow to her sister, a teacher to her aunt, a boy to a cousin with a bicycle that exists because the town agrees it does. We sent a priest we did not trust to an uncle we trusted less. He traveled perfectly because distrust had perfected his papers. We sent a dancer who wanted Vienna to Besançon, and she wrote back later that the stairs were kind. When I stacked the 500th, I did not clap. I cooled it. Then I opened my ledger, the one with no names, and wrote the only entry that matters. Window fog equals go. Milk shines equals wait. Tram 3 equals move. Dogs in equals safe. Stamp bleeds equals age. Hungry clerk equals praise alignment. Board sergeant equals give him a receipt to scold. I sealed it with breath and turned the timer to the wall. The factory of names rested, which is to say the town learned again how to be visible in the day and invisible at night. In the morning, I set a loaf on the sill for the unknown very brave and tied a twine tail on the package for the postmistress who never asks why. The tram confessed 3, faithful to its dishonesty. Ink said citizen one more time and meant it. The town walked out wearing its tomorrows, and the papers stayed behind like footprints no snow would keep. It didn't happen in a blaze. It happened in paperwork. On a Tuesday that smelled of soap and cabbage, our town quietly ceased to exist where offices keep their faith. Not the stones, not the roofs, just the ledger that tells uniforms what is real. We had practiced for months, forging persons one by one. Now we forged a pattern large enough to hold everyone who needed it. The rehearsal began in bells. Father R. agreed to ring the second at 6 minutes late and the third at 9 minutes early, which is the kind of heresy only a hungry parish notices. The tram did its honest lie of 3. The baker sent steam at 5 past instead of on the hour. The postmistress mislaid a satchel containing nothing anyone could afford to find. If you were in a window, it looked like a town suffering a case of Monday. If you were holding my ledger, it sounded like go/wait/move sung in 3 parts. On the desks that count us, we became a place of elsewhere. The prefect's nephew, proud of his alignment, processed a day's worth of departures to not here. Aunties in Besançon, cousins near a canal, apprentices recalled to factories that had learned to be patient with paperwork. The station office, charmed by its own serifs, stamped sleepy seals into the lower left and went home on time. The bridge sergeant, who respects a document that knows how to sigh, waved through men with pockets that remembered wallets. A town walks out in pieces or not at all. We didn't move everyone. We moved the load-bearing silences. The librarian packed obedience onto the shelf where courage lives and then stayed to misfile tomorrow. The baker's boy, who could be counted by anyone with ears, traded his squeaky shoes for a cousin's that know how to wait. A mother with the kind of face offices call interesting received a widow's card that taught her to be unremarkable. Those who remained learned to fold themselves small and look like Tuesday when Boots asked. At noon the factory changed shape. We weren't making people, we were making a day. I stacked families by routes instead of blood, bound stacks with twine tails the postmistress would understand, and seasoned the packets with a pinch of town, flour at the fold, a thread from the haberdasher, a pencil smudge that smelled like ledger. The rule held, rest before slicing. We cooled the stacks on the table as if they were loaves, hot paper tears, and so do plans. Risk took its tithe and demanded theater. So we gave it a parade of decoys. A clutch of 2 clean documents marched through a checkpoint where men needed to feel useful. Applause was taken, reports were filed, pride sat down to eat. Meanwhile the real work moved by errand. A woman bringing buttons, a boy delivering twine, a porter offended about boot polish. No heroics. Errands survive. By dusk the registers in 3 offices agreed. Our town was elsewhere, or at least busy being so. In kitchens, supper rehearsed ordinary. In corridors, doors remembered to be polite, twice. The loose board sang, then learned silence. The hinge 2 left confessed, then forgave itself. Dogs yawned, fed late on purpose. If anyone had taken a photograph, it would have shown nothing worth keeping. That's what salvation looks like from the street. We did not celebrate. We counted. Those who had crossed, those who were crossing, those who were meant to stay and make stability look accidental. I opened the ledger with no names and wrote the only entry that mattered in a town that had negotiated with paper and won. Window fogged equals go. Milk shines equals wait. Tram 3 equals move. Dogs yet equals safe. Stamp bleeds equals age. Hungry clerk equals praise alignment. Board sergeant equals give him a receipt to scold. Then I sealed it with the stamp I trust most, breath. The test came wearing a hat that believed in geometry, the kind of inspector who measures a town with a ruler and expects it to behave. He stepped off the tram exactly when the bell confessed its honest 3, annoyed that rails had the nerve to be human. He walked our Tuesday like a man counting angles. Bridge first, then station, then prefecture. A triangle you can draw without lifting your pen. Triangles comfort men who think people are lines. At the bridge, he faced the sergeant who respects a document that knows how to sigh. Our porter, offended about boot polish on command, arrived on cue with pockets full of receipts. The inspector admired the ink, found the staple 1 hole low, and decided the desk must wobble. Truth, correctly placed, looks like clumsiness. He stamped sleepy in the lower left because the stamp's pride was tired. At the station, he interrupted a clerk who was in love with serifs. I praised the penmanship from the back of the line, and pride made room for mercy the way bread makes room for steam. A widow with a face that used to be interesting became a woman whose shawl knew how to apologize for keeping her warm. She placed her papers on the counter and then, like a person who has lived long with bills, placed a coin on top, a gesture older than borders. The inspector felt respected and, being a man, called it order. He arrived at the prefecture while the nephew was still polishing alignment. The nephew, who believes a straight line makes a straight soul, presented ledgers that told a satisfying story. Departures correctly spelled, arrivals threaded to other towns with a seamstress's modesty. My stacks had traveled there smelling faintly of flour and wax. The nephew called it the perfume of competence. Competence makes superiors hungry and therefore generous. Satisfied to be obeyed by paper, the inspector came looking for people to punish. That is when he found my door. He knocked thrice. Of course he did. I waited 2 heartbeats, then answered twice, and the door performed politeness like a clerk who has learned to save rooms from men. He stepped into a Monday, mending, buttons, market soup open to the page where onions, potatoes, cabbage. Water makes something that feeds policemen and children without lying to either. He held the book like evidence. I let him. He asked for names. I gave him chores. This M wants patience. This button wants a story. This kettle waits for the moment when steam writes weather on the window. He tried to offend me with order. I offended him back with competence. Competence feels like obedience to men who do not so. He sniffed for ink and found vanilla. He looked for stamps and found laundry. He asked why my window was fogged at the wrong time. Biscuits, I said, and opened the oven to let the room agree. Authority retreats from biscuits because they make it human. He recovered by asking whether I was related to the librarian. I said everyone in a town is related by errands. He wrote it down, pleased to have a quote that proved he was a man who listens. He demanded my ledger. I handed him the one with no names. He frowned at entries that sound like weather. Window fogged equals go. Milk shines equals wait. Tram 3 equals move. Is this a code? It's housekeeping, I said. Housekeeping is what you call it when women run a city while men are away. He underlined housekeeping because he needed a villain smaller than himself. The dogs performed boredom right on schedule. The hinged 2 left confessed. The loose board in the corridor sang, and then learned silence. He followed the music the way a man follows a rumor, stopped at the nick on the jamb, and discovered a lock that prefers short keys. He stared at the nick as if it might grow a name. It did not. The trick to surviving a man who loves evidence is to give him facts that won't swear. He produced a sample passport to test me, the decoy we built to be caught. 2 clean, 2 matching, parade ready. Recognize this? He asked. My aunt would. I said, it's her favorite kind, new. He smiled the thin smile of a man who has been praised by an enemy. Then his thumb found the staple, 1 hole lower than a tidy desk would place it. And he relaxed because the world had agreed to be human again. He tried mercy in the shape of a trap. If you have friends in trouble, he said, tell me one, and I will spare your house. I told him my house spares itself by baking. He did not like being dismissed as a customer. He asked whether I feared the audit that would surely come. Audits are like soufflés, I said. Open the door at the wrong time, and you get nothing. He wrote soufflé very carefully, as if the accent might arrest me. Afternoon performed its decency. The tram apologized for being late with its bell. The postmistress made room for an extra sack that did not exist yesterday. The librarian filed obedience under courage and labeled it temporary. The baker's boy wore shoes that had forgotten how to squeak. The inspector walked among these ordinary miracles and concluded the war had finally taught us to behave. He reported as much to the nephew, who underlined behave and took the afternoon off to polish his alignment somewhere private. I waited until the inspector stepped back onto his triangle. Prefecture, station, bridge, then counted the breaths it takes a man to leave a place he never understood. 4 breath 4. When the tram took him, the town exhaled. We did not cheer. We cooled. Hot towns tear. At Vespers, I opened my ledger with no names and added a line for the day we convinced paper to lie for good. Triangle obeyed. Biscuit defense successful. Staple 1 hole low. 2 knocks everywhere. Decoy parade applauded. Town practiced ordinary without being asked. I sealed it with breath and turned the timer to the wall. Tomorrow would arrive hungry. We would feed it. Night closed like a ledger that had earned its sleep. That's when the last part of the plan, the part no one applauds, began. Maintenance. Salvation isn't a trumpet. It's a checklist. I walked the room with a pencil and a pocket of twined tails. tying off the day where it had frayed. The kettle wrote weather on the glass. I read it as instructions. Fast fog equals photographs tomorrow. Slow equals seals. No fog equals aging and cover. Salvations that last are built out of tomorrows. We rotated the silences that carry load. The librarian returned from misfiling obedience under courage and stacked a column of newspapers no one would read, but everyone would obey. The postmistress traded a sack with yesterday's date for one stamp today because dates, like uniforms, believe in their own clothes. The baker dusted the day's bundles so they smelled like mercy cooling. When mercy cools, it slices clean. We counted the missing loudly enough to hear everyone who needed hearing. The porter with the receipts, through. The widow with the shawl, through. The boy with the low cap and the habit of nodding as if he'd heard the question yesterday, through. The priest we did not trust, through perfectly, because distrust hones documents. The dancer who wanted Vienna, Besançon received her kindly. Stares were reasonable. The schoolmistress who became a sister, through. A mother whose face used to interest offices, now unremarkable, which is the highest rank paper can give. But salvation keeps a bill. The inspector's tidy shadow lingered in corners that like to collect pride. Pride is contraband. I swept it into a dustpan with pins, buttons, and the staple I always put one hole low. We hid it where contraband becomes useful, in a drawer labeled socks. Then I opened the cake tin marked vanilla and took inventory. Matches, string, the little salt a baker keeps near fire, a half stick of black that believes in you, a thimble for nights you must push. Audits are hungry. You feed them elsewhere. The building rehearsed its music one more time like a chorus that knows its part. Two left, the hinge confessed. The loose board sang. The dogs in the yard yawned. Fed late on purpose. The tram rang its small, faithful three. If you were the kind of man who measures a town with angles, the night would have looked like nothing. Nothing is the favorite camouflage of lives. I wrote letters nobody will file to people who will never receive them. Dear unknown, very brave. The door stayed polite because you taught it twice. Dear clerk, your 2 clips on top and one inside rebuilt a bridge no map admits. Dear boy, you learned to stand still without feeling useless. Stillness saves more necks than speed. Dear librarian, thank you for misfiling tomorrow until it found the right shelf. I tucked the letters into pockets that exist only when kitchens remember they are embassies. Near midnight, rumor came back from patrol with teeth in it. The inspector had praised the nephew's alignment in a report that would travel farther than kindness. Pride travels faster than bread. So we prepared the antidote, ordinary. Ordinary is stronger than rage because it can be performed indefinitely. We assigned shifts. The porter would be offended about boot polish every other afternoon. The widow's shawl would apologize for warmth on sight. The boy's cap would sit too low on days ending in Y. Rehearsal schedules save towns from improvisations they can't afford. Then came the 500th receipt. Not a passport, not a miracle, just a slip a clerk could scold with dignity. I signed it with a 2. That limps the way our typewriter taught Maine. I love that too. It reminds men that paper is walked to a desk by humans who do not always arrive even. Limping numbers pass, where straight ones become speeches. I cooled the day on the table the way I cool bread, rest before slicing. Hot days tear. I turned the timer to the wall because some clocks have earned privacy. The kettle slept. The stamp pads forgot their pride. The typewriter listened to the tram and forgave itself again for not being perfect. Perfection is suspicious, almost as human. Before sleep, I opened the ledger that has no names and wrote the truth we had been forging all along. A town is not saved by heroes. A town is saved by errands that arrive after the second bell and before the third, by bread that cools, by doors that remain polite, by clerks who choose order over obedience, by stamps that land tired and therefore true, by papers that sigh when unfolded, by men who take 2 sugars and refuse a third because they need to believe in themselves, by women who teach time to pass for housekeeping. I sealed it with the stamp that outruns every warrant, breath. When morning came, it found me tying a twine tail around a parcel for the postmistress who never asks why. It found the librarian unlocking courage and shelving it under fiction. It found the boy carrying a package to an uncle with a bicycle that exists because we said it does. It found the sergeant at the bridge respecting documents that sigh. It found the nephew polishing alignment and mistaking it for virtue. It found the inspector elsewhere, counting angles, certain he had left this place measured. He had. He measured a town that no longer lives on his paper. And it found a seamstress at a table that had turned itself into a factory, and then into a church, and then back into a table, brushing milk on loaves the town would talk about, and leaving one unglazed for the corner that must remain quiet. 500 was a number. What mattered was this. Ink said citizen, and the town believed it long enough to become true.